There was a time in this country when a man with no college and a strong back could walk into an automobile factory in Detroit, get hired on the line, and build a whole good life out of it. A house, a car in the driveway, and another one for the wife, a boat, a little cottage up on a lake, 3 kids raised right and sent further than he ever got, and at the end of it, a pension that let him retire with his head up. My name is Earl Kowalski. I spent 44 years building and fixing American cars, 27 on the line at Buick City in Flint, and the rest in my own shop. I caught the tail end of that world, and my father lived its golden middle. And the union, the United Auto Workers, is the reason any of it was possible. Let me tell you what a factory job in Detroit used to mean, because it was the closest thing this country ever built to a promise, and most people today don't even know it existed. It did not start out that way. You have to understand that for the first part of the automobile age, working on the line was a miserable, brutal, low-paid job. The work was fast, dangerous, and the men were treated like part of the machinery, used up and replaced. What changed it was a fight and a couple of decisions that turned a hard job into the ticket to the middle class. The first decision came from Henry Ford himself back in 1914, and people still argue about why he did it. Ford announced he would pay his workers $5 a day, more than double the going wage. Now, Ford was no saint. He did it partly to stop men from quitting his soul-crushing assembly line, where the turnover was so bad he had to hire tens of thousands just to keep a few thousand. Out at the Ford Rouge plant on the River Rouge, they were running the biggest industrial complex in the world, and they couldn't keep men on it. But whatever his reasons, the $5 day changed everything. For the first time, the man who built the car could afford to buy the car. That idea, pay a working man enough to live a real life and he'll power the whole economy, is the seed of the American middle class, and it was planted on a factory floor in Detroit. But Ford's $5 came with strings, and it didn't last as a fair deal on its own. The thing that truly locked in the good life was not handed down by the bosses. It was won, the hard way, by the men themselves. In the bitter winter of 1936 and 37, the auto workers in Flint, my town, did something nobody had dared. They sat down. They occupied the General Motors plants and refused to leave for 44 days, sleeping inside, while their wives and neighbors passed food through the windows and the company cut the heat and threatened them. They held. And in the end, the most powerful corporation in the world had to sit down at a table and recognize their union, the United Auto Workers. That sit-down strike, right there in Flint, is one of the most important things that ever happened to the American working man. It meant the men who built the cars finally had a voice in what they were paid and how they were treated. From there, piece by piece, contract by contract, the factory job became something extraordinary. The biggest single leap came in 1950, with a landmark agreement between the UAW and General Motors that the newspapers of the day actually called the Treaty of Detroit. In that contract and the ones that followed it, the auto workers won the things that turned a paycheck into a life, real wages that rose with the cost of living. A COLA clause, they called it, a cost of living adjustment built right into the contract. Company paid health care for a man and his whole family, and, the big one, a pension. A guaranteed, dignified retirement for a factory worker. Things that had belonged only to the wealthy and the white-collar few were now written into the contract of a man who stood on a line bolting fenders. That, more than anything, is what built the dream. The man most responsible for that was the head of the UAW, a tough, red-headed former tool and die man named Walter Reuther. Reuther was a visionary and a fighter. He'd been beaten by company men at the Battle of the Overpass, right there at the Ford Rouge plant gate in 1937, and he survived 2 separate attempts on his life, shot through a window of his own home and nearly killed. But he understood something simple and powerful, that working men deserved not just better wages, but security and dignity, healthcare, pensions, a real stake in the prosperity they were building. The pensions and the medical coverage that became normal for millions of American workers in factories far beyond the auto industry, trace straight back to what Reuther and the auto workers won in Detroit. When you hear an old union man speak about him, there's a reverence in it because Reuther helped build the floor that a whole generation got to stand on. And there's a piece of this most people miss entirely. Those good factory jobs were a ladder, and millions of people climbed up out of poverty on it. During and after the war, the plants of Detroit drew families from all over the country. Hundreds of thousands of black families came north from the cotton fields of the South in the Great Migration, and poor white families came up from Appalachia, all of them chasing the same thing, a job on the line that paid enough to live like a human being. For a sharecropper's son who had never earned a steady wage in his life, a job at Ford or Dodge was the door into the American middle class. Detroit's population exploded past 1.5 million on the strength of it. Whole neighborhoods, whole churches, whole ways of life were built by people whose ticket up was a union card and a spot on an assembly line. The factory didn't just build cars. It built families, and it lifted them. And I lived in the world that contract created. Let me describe it to you because it's almost gone now and I don't want it forgotten. When I hired into Buick City in 1972, a job on that line was the most secure thing a young man could have. You started, you joined the union, and from that day your life had a floor under it. Your pay was good, better than a lot of men with diplomas were making. You could walk into a bank and get a mortgage on a solid brick house in a neighborhood where every other father on the street also worked at the plant. You bought a new car at the employee discount, proud to drive the very thing your hands had helped build. You put a boat in the garage, and if you saved a little cottage up north on one of Michigan's 10,000 lakes, where the family went every summer, your wife didn't have to work unless she wanted to, and you knew that the work would be there next year and the year after that. The whole life of a man was wrapped around that plant, and it was a rich life, even if nobody was rich. The work itself was hard and loud, and it wore your body down. I won't pretend otherwise. But when the whistle blew, you walked out with a brotherhood. You'd stood shoulder to shoulder with the same men for 20, 30 years. You bowled in the plant league on Tuesday nights, and let me tell you, the auto plant bowling leagues were serious business. Hundreds of teams. The union halls packed. You went to the company picnic in the summer where the kids ran wild and somebody always brought too much potato salad. You knew your co-workers' wives' names and their kids' names, and when one of you had a baby or buried a parent, the whole crew showed up. The plant wasn't just where you earned your money, it was the center of a whole community, a way of belonging. And here is the part that I think mattered most, the part that makes my throat tight even now. A man could see the whole shape of his life laid out in front of him, and it was good and it was certain. There was even a phrase for the end of it, 30 and out. You put in your 30 years, and you could retire with a full pension, often still young enough to enjoy it, to take that boat out on a Tuesday morning, while younger men took your place on the line. You had given the company your back and your years, and in return, you got a secure old age. And best of all, you knew there'd be a place for your son. You raised that boy knowing that if college wasn't for him, the plant would be. That he could have the same good life you had. The future felt safe. For a working family, that certainty was the whole dream. Not getting rich, just knowing you'd be okay, and your kids would be okay. The men knew what they had too. They were proud. They built the cars that won the war, and then the cars that put the whole country on wheels, and they did it with their own hands. And the wages let them live like the middle class they had fought to become. For about 30 years, from the end of the war into the 1970s, a factory town like Detroit or Flint had something close to the highest standard of living of working people anywhere on Earth. A blue-collar paradise built out of steel, sweat, and a union card. And then slowly, the floor that the strike and the Treaty of Detroit had built under a man's life began to give way. I lived through that part too, and it was a quieter heartbreak than the plant closings, but it cut just as deep. The companies started moving the work to other states, then other countries, where there was no union and no contract and no pension to pay. The plants began to close, one after another, and the secure jobs that a father had counted on passing to his son simply weren't there anymore. For the men who kept their jobs, the deal got worse. The company started offering new hires a lower wage for the same work. The two-tier wage system, they called it, which meant the young man on the line next to you was building the same car for half the promise. And the COLA adjustments and the pensions and the health care, the things they'd won in 1950 and believed were guaranteed forever. When the great car companies went into bankruptcy in 2009, when General Motors went through its government bailout and restructuring, a lot of retirees watched the benefits they'd worked 30 years for get cut down. The promise that had been written into those contracts turned out to be only as solid as the company that signed it. I watched Buick City wind down all through the 90s until they built the last vehicle there in 1999, and then I watched them tear it down to an empty field. But the building coming down was almost the smaller loss. The bigger loss was the thing the building had stood for, the idea that an ordinary man with no special advantages could trade his labor for a secure and dignified life and hand that same chance to his children. That idea is what really vanished. The young men in Flint and Detroit today can't walk into a plant at 18 and build the life my generation built. That road is closed, and nobody quite decided to close it out loud. The company just decided a quarter at a time that the deal was too expensive to keep. So when I get sentimental about the old days, understand it's not really about the cars, and it's not even about the money. It's about a promise this country used to keep to its working people. Show up, work hard, make something real with your hands, and you will earn a fair share and a secure place and a future for your kids. The auto workers of Detroit didn't have that promise handed to them. They sat down in the cold and fought for it in 1937, and they bargained for it across a table in 1950, and for one good generation, they actually got to live it. I was lucky enough to catch the end of it. My father got the whole golden middle of it. And I'm not sure this country has ever replaced what it had when a factory job in Detroit could build the American dream. I built these cars and I fixed them for 44 years, and I'd give a lot to walk back into Buick City on a Monday morning one more time. Now I want to hear from you. Did you or your father or your grandfather work in the plants? GM, Ford, Chrysler, the suppliers, any of it? What did that job give your family? Tell me down in the comments where your people put in their years, because I think there are a lot more of us out here who remember that promise than this country wants to admit.